the world's got a carbon problem. I can tell you, as someone who toughed out 31 days above 110 degrees in Phoenix this past summer, that was a serious wake-up call.
So where does hydrogen come into this? Well, hydrogen has an amazing flexibility to, I'm going to say, replace some of the characteristics of the fossil fuel system without the emissions.
And the question on the table was how the power sector could get to zero in an equitable way by 2035 or 2040.
Then the issue is not, how can I say, can we get enough? It's what do we do with the extra energy?
And now our first panel of AREDAY Impact 2023. I'd like to just go down the line and introduce each panelist. Gary Dirks, who's the moderator, working presently at Lightworks at ASU, and very focused on such complicated subjects like direct air capture of carbon. I'm just a brief introduction. So thank you, Gary, for coming. Henk Rogers from Hawaii, New York, and other places. And he is the founder of Tetris, but actually he works most of his time with the Blue Planet Alliance and trying to create a 100% renewable energy world by 2045. And principally involved in getting that mandate passed in the state of Hawaii, which is, I think, perhaps the only state that has that. Maybe I'm wrong. You'll tell us.
State of 13, though.
Fantastic. Thank you for your leadership. Governor Bill Ritter, a dear friend of mine. We met when he was running for governor way back in 2006, I think it was. And very grateful for your leadership, Bill, over your 4 years, passing 57 clean energy bills in the state of Colorado in that brief time, and now sits at the Colorado State University running his new energy economy think tank. Thank you, Bill. And then Bill Brandt, who is also the co-chair of AREI, and he is working also down at ASU, facilitating all kinds of wonderful technologies that can either keep carbon from going into the atmosphere or pull it back out. And so with that, thank you, Gary.
Well, thank you, Chip, and welcome everyone to our panel on From Renewables to Hydrogen. Chip has already given a bit of an introduction to each of us, but what I will do now is invite each of the panelists to say anything more they choose to about themselves and their relationship to this subject of renewables to hydrogen, and then give a few framing comments about how hydrogen or renewables relates to the work that they do and the things that they're interested in. And I'm just going to start at the far end, Bill, with you, and tell us a little bit more about your background and what about renewables to hydrogen.
Right. Gary, thank you, and good morning. Everybody can hear me. So I'm Bill Brandt. I work at Arizona State University, and I'm the Director of Strategic Integration at ASU Lightworks. Lightworks is an initiative that sort of pulls across the university to bring people together to sort of work on some of these complex and interesting systems like the energy system. I started my career having finished grad school working for an oil company called Sohio. It was the original Standard Oil company. It was acquired by BP and then had a 30-year career working in London on various things in finance, including mergers and acquisitions. So when I retired, I came to ASU to start working on renewable energy. It was quite clear that that was going to be something that we were going to need, particularly as it became evident that the CO2 buildup in the atmosphere, including other gases, were starting to cause an impact. And now we're seeing more of that impact as it manifests itself in all kinds of things that are happening to our climate. So it's important that we move with some speed to get things done. This panel is talking about renewable energy and hydrogen, and so I thought it would be appropriate for me to make a few remarks about hydrogen as one of the paths to a sustainable future. So the global energy system is kind of a complicated system, and it's grown up over a couple hundred years, just to put some context and framing into it. And most of what we have today is a legacy of what happened around 1900 or the 20th century as we think about our systems. When you think about renewable resources, you think about solar and you think about wind, right? And the output of these systems are electrons that flow across our transmission and grid system, which basically was formed through policy between 1900 and 1920. And it's done a great job of creating what I'm going to call, interesting energy to run lighting first and then electric motors, courtesy of Tesla and a few other people who managed to do that. And it's created a very interesting ecosystem. On the other side of our energy ecosystem is fossil fuels, which are the reason that we're sort of rethinking our energy system because of the carbon dioxide that's emitted for them. And it's important to understand that that system grew up around the automotive industry and the need to move fuel very efficiently and effectively around the nation and around the planet. Now, so if you think about, there's an above ground system called the electricity system and a below ground system called fossil fuels. That's a good way for us to start the conversation. And it's important to recognize that fossil fuels, when they move below ground through pipelines and other things, are a very efficient way of moving energy. The amount of energy density in a fossil fuel is significant. So what we're going to do is we're going to basically try to turn down the fossil fuel side of this and then improve what's going on above the ground. And I would just make the observation that's a non-trivial system. So where does hydrogen come into this? Well, hydrogen has an amazing flexibility to, I'm going to say, replace some of the characteristics of the fossil fuel system without the emissions. It is a little complicated to use because it's a gas, and being a very, very light gas, moving it around is complicated. So as we think about, the hydrogen system, we think about, well, what is it that we're going to have to do in order to build an ecosystem around the transition from fossil fuels to clean energy, and hydrogen is one of the pathways that can do that. So many of you probably are, deeply experienced around hydrogen, but I thought it might be useful just to set a little context for what kinds of hydrogen, are out there, so that we at least have some kind of a basis for doing that. And I'll just say that steam methane reforming is a process that takes methane and water and it produces hydrogen and carbon dioxide. It's the kind of process of choice if you want to make hydrogen, and it's called gray hydrogen if you don't collect the CO2, but it's called blue hydrogen if you collect the CO2 and then put it into the ground, through a sequestration system. Now, it is the dominant form of hydrogen production. So let's just say 98% of the world produces hydrogen this way, and it costs about $1.50 a kilogram to do that. Now, green hydrogen is made through the use of electrons going through an electrolyzer that come from either solar or wind. And this means that there's no carbon produced. It's an electrolysis program, so what you're basically doing is splitting water, and then that produces hydrogen and oxygen. And this is the place where we think there's going to be a huge potential. It's also the place where the legislation that was enacted in 2001 and 2022 are going to create a real interesting opportunity. And it's this place where we think we're going to have hydrogen as a basis for sort of replacing fossil fuels and then creating this transmission system that allows us to do that in a way that's not disruptive. Now, there are two other things that I should mention. One is you've heard of pink hydrogen. That's using basically the electrons from a nuclear power plant, which are zero carbon emissions to make hydrogen. And then methane pyrolysis, which is a rather new study using temperatures over 1,000 degrees centigrade to actually produce hydrogen and carbon in its solid form, so you don't have any CO2 emissions. So I think, Gary, probably it's best for me to stop there, having set the scene for where we are. And
Thank you, Bill. Governor Ritter.
Yeah, thanks. So a little bit different than Bill's orientation on this. As Chip said, I run a policy center at Colorado State University and have since 2011. We work with states, we work with governors, we work with legislators, have a legislator academy, and convene a lot of different meetings with governors. And like right now, it's about the new power plant rules, it's about Inflation Reduction Act, the bipartisan infrastructure law, just to build capacity in states to do what they can in the energy transition, we call it. But every once in a while I get asked to do something that's a little bit different. And about 3 years ago, I was asked to convene a group of utility CEOs, environmental NGOs, so think Environmental Defense Fund, the Nature Conservancy, World Resource Institute, and then environmental justice leaders. And the question on the table was how the power sector could get to zero in an equitable way by 2035 or 2040, because the Biden plan called for 2035. And so for 2 years, I was the stakeholder person, brought all stakeholders into the conversation and then had the groups there. And the reason I know enough about hydrogen, I guess, to be on the panel is that we had the best utilities in the class, sort of. You know, the ones that have these ambitious goals. Xcel Energy here in Colorado is going to get to 85% reduction in emissions by 2030. It's baked into the law. They have to get there. They made that their own goal, but then the legislators turned around and passed laws to say they're going to get to 85% by 2030. And so it's going to be about 85% renewable in their portfolio. But then our independent power producer, Tri-State, which produces power for co-ops in New Mexico, Colorado, Wyoming, part of Nebraska, they also have an 80% requirement, 80% reduction by 2030. So that's big, right? But nobody has an idea about how they're going to get to that last mile. So the question on the table was zero or net zero by 2035 or 2040, and the best utilities were saying, we don't know right now what the path is to zero. We know the path to 80 or 85. Some utilities aren't going to be able to probably get to 80 or 85 by 2030, even if they tried, because of where their grid is and the availability or non-availability of renewables. But certainly as we looked at the potential for that, and remember we had environmental justice leaders in the group as well, we looked at the potential and looked at several different options. So carbon capture and sequestration is a topic in the next panel. That was on the table. Nuclear and advanced nuclear, which all wound up, being sort of an added tax credit to come into the Inflation Reduction Act. So small modular reactors or different kinds of technologies in nuclear that aren't part of our conventional nuclear portfolio now. That was on the table, but then so was hydrogen. And so hydrogen became part of our discussion in how could it assist the power sector in getting to zero or net zero? And we had these conversations. And I think one of the reasons we were having this conversation was trying to help the Congress with Build Back Better. That was what was the first Biden plan. And after the infrastructure law, it wound up being the Inflation Reduction Act. But you'll see in the Inflation Reduction Act, a lot of the things that we discussed found their way into the IRA, incentivized in some way by both the infrastructure law actually and the Inflation Reduction Act. So hydrogen is on the table as a way for the power sector at least to think about zero or net zero. I'd say there's a lot of folks in the transportation industry that also see a path forward possibly for hydrogen. When I was governor, Schwarzenegger was governor in California, and they actually had a concept called the Hydrogen Highway in California that was going to very much depend upon the build out of a hydrogen industry so that they could have fuel cell cars that were run off of hydrogen. So that's the deal, Gary. It's part of this discussion about decarbonization, and I think we're going to talk later about how it finds its way into federal policy. But there are people who are very big believers in hydrogen being kind of the answer for zero or net zero.
Thank you very much, Governor. Hank.
Yeah, this discussion about getting to 100%, I think that's a strange discussion, because what we need to do is look at what happened in Iceland. They didn't go for 100%, they went for 300%. And what it did is it brought the price of electricity down to the point where they could become the aluminum suppliers of Europe. And that's a very energy-intensive, energy-hog industry. We need to go, when we think about Hawaii, for example, we need to go to 130 or 140%. And then the issue is not, how can I say, can we get enough? It's what do we do with the extra energy? That's a good thing to have. My history with hydrogen goes way back. And nobody knows this in the room because this is before my computer game career. I worked for my father in the gem business. And I ended up, at the end of 6 years, spending a year in Bangkok heat treating rubies and sapphires to change the color to make them more valuable. Well, the way to do it is to remove some of the oxygen from the stone so that it changes the color. And to do that, we needed to work with hydrogen. I needed to work with hydrogen. So I spent 6 months working with hydrogen. I built hydrogen furnaces, and we used hydrogen. It was all about hydrogen. Fast forward, so I have a foundation in Hawaii, the Blue Planet Foundation. And the mission of the foundation is to end the use of carbon-based fuel in Hawaii. And we passed all kinds of laws. Yes, our claim to fame is that we passed the first mandate in the country of 100% renewable energy by any date. Our date was 2045. But on the way to doing this, we passed other pieces of legislation, and one was solar rebates. You know, this happens in a lot of places. And we passed so that everybody who put solar on their rooftop, they would get a rebate. And what happened was, we did a calculation, kind of, back of the envelope. Oh, we'll have about 30 megawatts of rooftop solar in like a couple of years. Well, we had 300. And what happened was the utility said, wait, we cannot handle that much variable electricity on the grid. A grid can't happen. We're talking about voltage and frequency problems, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And I'm going, oh my gosh. By that time, we had like 200 solar installer companies in Hawaii. There was a boom in solar. There were more people working in solar outside than there were people working for the electric company inside. And so we had created a whole new industry and so on. And then I have a little ranch on the Big Island. I'm thinking, like, what do we need to do to get past this? And so then I thought, first of all, they weren't going to let me grid tie. And then I said, okay, well, I'm just going to disconnect. Maybe that's the answer. Everybody just disconnect. And so we went into figuring out how to disconnect. We spent a year with vanadium redox flow batteries, and that was a disaster. We ended up with a very nice chemistry, lithium ferrous phosphate. Now everybody's using it. We took the ranch off grid. But when you're off grid, this is my experience at the ranch, you need to build it so that it works on a cloudy day. And so on a cloudy day, we have enough solar, and solar is cheap. I mean, it's like, if you're going to get somebody to put solar in, if you double the amount of solar, it doesn't cost you that much money. It's bringing those people out there to do the job in the first place that costs the money. Once they're out there, the panels themselves are cheap. And, anyway, so we overbuilt the solar, and then we had by 9:30 or 10 o'clock in the morning on a regular sunny day, the batteries are at 100%. What do we do with the rest of the energy? So we decided to figure that out, and we used the rest of the energy to make hydrogen. So I bought an electrolyzer, and I just wanted to find out what's up with hydrogen on a kind of a grid scale situation. So we don't have a use for hydrogen, that's the problem. We have enough stored, we store about 25 kilos of hydrogen at the ranch, and the DOE, by the way, Department of Energy, they came by and said, we heard you guys are making hydrogen. I says, well, yeah. And I said, would you like some stuff? It's like, stuff? So I sent my CTO to Honolulu, and there's a warehouse about the size of this room full of stuff. You know, there were 6 hydrogen fuel cell forklifts and 22 hydrogen fuel cell forklift, whatever, fuel cells. Anyway, there's a room full of stuff, uprights and all kinds of stuff. And my guy goes, can I have that and that and that and that and that? And the guy goes, you don't understand. I need my warehouse back. It's all or nothing. So we got all these fuel cells. I mean, fuel cells actually are very expensive, especially in that period of time when it was mostly still on the research level. Anyway, we got all this stuff. So we have all the fuel cells that we're going to need to do any kind of research at the ranch. It's a great situation. I think, and we bought a Mirai. We have a hydrogen fueling station. I think that the future for islands, Hawaii is an island, is for us to build wind and solar and geothermal to about 130, 140% of what we actually need to make electricity, and then use the extra electricity to make hydrogen. And hydrogen can be a backup fuel. We could bring it from the Big Island to Oahu, this is where the consumption, 80% of the people live on Oahu, 80% of the land is on the Big Island, and we have volcanoes. We have geothermal up the wazoo. And so this, I think, is the future. The future should be that we're producing hydrogen in places where it's cheap and easy to produce hydrogen. I believe for the world that the Ring of Fire, for example, all those volcanoes, all that heat that's coming from the center of the Earth, which isn't going to go away anytime soon. There's nothing we can do to affect that heat. There's so much of it. The Ring of Fire should produce hydrogen, and we can ship hydrogen using hydrogen ships to islands that don't have enough wind or solar to cover their own needs. And it's a transportation fuel. Now, the transportation aspect of it, I have battery electric cars. They're great. They're amazing. The problem is when you make a truck or a bus, by the time you add up all the batteries, you're spending all your energy moving batteries. They weigh a ton. And we figured this out. I mean, people figured this out. We had a hydrogen boat come to Hawaii. I mean, sailboat, kind of a hydrogen covered with solar panels. And the reason they're using hydrogen instead of using batteries is that the damn thing would sink if they try to use batteries for that purpose. So hydrogen is a much lighter way of storing electricity than batteries. And so if you're going to do trucks and buses, you need to use hydrogen. And hydrogen is basically an electric vehicle without all the weight. And the other benefit is that you can charge a hydrogen vehicle in a couple of minutes. You're going from high pressure to low pressure, and that's about it. So away goes this hours and hours of charging, and it becomes instant. So that is the future. I believe that there's going to be enough ground transportation to take up the extra 40% hydrogen that gets produced if we go 140%.
Thank you, gentlemen. I'd like to consolidate this just a little bit because you've gotten three very different perspectives and three very good different perspectives. Big picture, the world's got a carbon problem, and that's going to give us quite a serious climate problem. I can tell you, as someone who toughed out 31 days above 110 degrees in Phoenix this past summer, that was a serious wake-up call, as in a very serious wake-up call. 105, even 108, okay. You can go outside. If you're well hydrated, you're probably okay. You go outside at 110, you better not stay out there very long. And when it's 115, you really shouldn't go out there very much at all. So this is kind of what we're trying to do. We got to get the carbon out of the system. As Bill Brandt says, this hydrocarbon system is very sophisticated. It moves a lot of energy. We cannot underestimate what it's going to take in order to replace that. That's not to say that we should be in any way discouraged. It just said, take it serious. This is a big problem. And the Governor Ritter described how the political system and how the way in which we're beginning to think about what our toolkit looks like. And this is something I really want to emphasize. And Henk did that as well. Hydrogen is one tool in our toolkit. It's not the only tool in the toolkit. It is one of them. And it does come up often, Governor, in the context, and this is the case in our state, in Arizona. The electric utilities, and Henk heard it, and they got through it in Hawaii, and we got to think about what they did. The utilities can see how to get to 80%. Ours are saying exactly the same thing. We can see how to get to 80%. That last 20 looks hard to us. And hydrogen often comes up in that context. Now, if I could, Governor, I'd like to come back to you, because you mentioned in passing AREI-AREDAY, the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act. the IRA, Inflation Reduction Act. These are a big deal. This is a lot of money, and hydrogen is right smack in the middle of the AREI-AREDAY. Can you tell us a little bit more about what is the Biden administration trying to do? And then if I could, pick up on WISH, if you would. You can tell people what WISH is.
Yeah. So first of all, I think AREI-AREDAY is just a hard acronym. So I call it the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law because it's Bill, and that's my name. It's easy to remember. And then the IRA, the Inflation Reduction Act. And so first in the infrastructure law, they put $11 billion into hydrogen, $3 billion for projects, $8 billion for research hubs. They call them hubs. There have to be a minimum of at least 4. One of them has to go in West Virginia. Not a surprise, but
and we have no idea why that's the case, do we?
but they screened the first round of applications and then invited further screening, I guess. And they're going to announce sometime at the end of the year where the hubs will be. So there's $8 billion for hydrogen research. It was a really big ticket item to come out of the Department of Energy as part of the infrastructure law. And I think, a lot of different places around the country are sitting and waiting and hoping that they're chosen. I think California has 3 separate applications in for hydrogen hubs. Texas has a couple of different applications in. So in Colorado, what happened, and it kind of started at Colorado State University with Dr. Brian Wilson, who runs the Energy Institute, and became very interested in this idea about a hub, but knew that Colorado as a single player was unlikely to, be able to get a hub. So he and I and some other people began putting together 4 states, Wyoming, Utah, New Mexico, and Colorado. So 2 Ds for governors, 2 Rs. So it's a very bipartisan application. And then began bringing in sort of the academic community, the regulator community, the governor's office, so the government community, and the private sector. And looking at the private sector and thinking about what ways could the private sector be part of a public-private partnership if we were to get a hub. So it's called WISH, Western Interstate Hydrogen. I forget what the S is. Do you remember?
Interstate Hydrogen Hub.
Interstate Hydrogen Hub. So anyway, so it's those 4 states, and it was a really interesting conversation in sort of building that out because Governor Polis here in Colorado is very interested in just green hydrogen research. And I've been in rooms with the governor and environmental groups who were expressing concerns about hydrogen, in part because of the ability to use fossil fuels to manufacture hydrogen, and this idea that the fossil fuel industry is not going away if we're going to use it as part of a way to manufacture it. But the governor has said, well, in Colorado, we're going to be about green hydrogen. But in Wyoming, Utah, and New Mexico, with a Democratic governor, Governor Lujan Grisham is still very much about trying to save her natural gas industry. I was telling these guys in the green room in New Mexico, the 40% of the entire state's revenue comes from the federal royalty that the state gets half of that comes off of the Permian Basin. 40%. So if natural gas goes away altogether as an industry, that governor would have to find a way somehow to replace 40%. She sees hydrogen as a path forward to do that. She had a couple of bills herself that were state bills. They both got defeated a year ago. She didn't come back with it this year, but it's been a kind of a bumpy road for her where she's trying to look at the economy in New Mexico and understand what's the role that hydrogen plays in it. The final thing I'll say is here in Colorado, we passed a hydrogen bill this year, and it was basically around the permitting of hydrogen and the infrastructure needed to manufacture hydrogen. But the environmental justice community was very, very concerned that all these facilities are going to be built in marginalized communities, and so they actually had the legislation amended, and the final law said this, that if there has to be a comprehensive analysis of each hydrogen manufacturing plant, and if in that comprehensive analysis there's a negative, any kind of a net negative to a community, the plant cannot be permitted. Mm-hmm. So there's an environmental justice angle to this as well, in part again because the environmental crowd looks at this and sees that it could be a role for fossil fuel going forward, and that's problematic in their mind, and there's a lot of other people saying it's going to have to be that. And just finally, the Inflation Reduction Act and the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law both look at a formula for hydrogen and say, okay, you can manufacture hydrogen using fossil fuels, but we're going to look at the unit of carbon dioxide emitted or the unit of greenhouse gases emitted, the unit of hydrogen produced, and it has to be sort of this formula in order for it to be clean. You can use fossil fuels to produce it, but we still want it to come to this index of clean hydrogen.
Thank you very much, Bill. And just to elaborate a little bit, the importance of the hubs, I don't think can be overemphasized with respect to pushing hydrogen forward as an option. As the governor described, the idea is a network of these hydrogen hubs that are all connected together. And I do look over at the governor with a little bit of envy because I and Bill Brandt were on another team, Arizona and Nevada. You guys got an interview, we didn't. So you're probably going to get one, and we're probably not in Arizona. But the idea is to link all of these things together. And right in the act is it's okay to reform natural gas as long as you capture and store the carbon.
Can I say just one other thing that I omitted? Also, the EPA released its power plant rules, the replacement for the Clean Power Plan that was struck down by the court. And in doing that, they very much put hydrogen blending with natural gas as a part of a formula that's kind of dated, like 2035, 2040, 2045. But in that 2030 to 2040 timeframe, there's absolutely the possibility of running natural gas, even newly built natural gas, blended with hydrogen.
Hank, what's Hawaii going to do about all this?
So we've been working in Hawaii. By the way, our foundation has already been successful in moving Hawaii towards 100% renewable energy. So what do we do next? And the three things that I've commanded them to do next is, one is ground transportation. Let's have a date beyond which internal combustion engine cars are no longer sold in Hawaii. But the other one is hydrogen and geothermal. So hydrogen, Hawaii is the perfect place to do hydrogen. I'm pitching for Hawaii now. Because it's a closed system. First of all, you can't drive off the island. You can drive in a circle to your next hydrogen station. So I think our plan is to build 5 hydrogen fueling stations on the Big Island. We've already talked to the mayor about, he's got 24 almost dead diesel buses that service the Big Island. Only 6 of them are running at any given time. So he's agreed to buy, the next one would be a hydrogen bus fleet. And we've also talked to the biggest transportation company about buying hydrogen tractors, like tractor-trailer tractors. It's a chicken and the egg situation. Which comes first, the hydrogen production or the hydrogen consumption? And the answer is they have to happen at the same time. And those are generally completely different organizations, like the transportation organizations and the generation organization. They're different companies with different motivations. And so the money that's coming out of DC that has to do with the IRA money to help the hydrogen hub would be very well spent. We could have an example of an island or a place that completely flipped to a hydrogen economy, meaning including the transportation, including figuring out what to do with the excess wind and solar, because we have too much of it on the Big Island sometimes. We can do all of it on the Big Island. And by the way, the #1 most visited national park in the country is Volcanoes National Park. So everybody in the country goes to the Hawaii to see what's going on. They will get to see what hydrogen is all about. So,
A story about making it all happen together at the same time. I didn't say a lot about my background, but Bill and I were colleagues at BP, and I retired in 2009 as president of BP Asia Pacific and president of BP China. In 2006, I had a deal with Singapore, and I would build a hydrogen service station, and they would get hydrogen buses, and they would stimulate getting cars from Japan, as it turns out. And so I did, built a hydrogen service station. And when I reached maximum market penetration in Singapore, I had 4 customers. One was a bus that they actually did come up with. One was a car that BP owned. One was a guy that was crazy and just had a car. And the third was a demonstration vehicle from Mercedes. We didn't run that hydrogen service station very long. Today, I think we're in a much stronger position to be able to do exactly what you described. Now, I'd like to come back to using green energy, because I think you made some really important points. You have wind, you have solar, you also have geothermal, which means you can probably provide pretty steadily 24 hours a day a source of electrons into electrolyzers and get fully green hydrogen. Not all of us can, and if I could turn to you, Bill Brandt, you know, one of the weaknesses in our proposal in Arizona is we got sun, not a lot else. So what do we got to do here? What do the economics look like if you can't run 24/7?
Yeah, that's a really good point, Gary. So I'll just make a couple observations. One is that the federal government's proposal basically is to put a ton of money into some organized chaos to get it more organized, so that you make the point about you got to have demand appearing at the same time that you have production. Now, what that also means is that solar is going to produce more electrons too, because one of the elements of the BIL and IRA is to give you a production tax credit for solar. So that means there's going to be a lot of electrons moving around where we're going to have to figure out what to do with them, which is like pretty fantastic when you think about hydrogen. It also means it's pretty fantastic if anybody can come up with a better idea of how to store these electrons so that they can be reused. And that is fundamentally going to be a game changer, that solar is actually going to produce electrons that's so cheap. So if you think about then what do you need to do in getting the ecosystem going? So we have electrons in Arizona, then we have to think about, well, where do they go? They could certainly go to making hydrogen in Arizona. But hydrogen, to move it is a little more complicated. It's not like gasoline where you just put it in a pipe and move it. You have to refrigerate it, and you have to deeply refrigerate it to like minus 250 degrees centigrade, which is possible, but it's not trivial. And so, you know, when you think about these systems, we have to start thinking about what does our grid look like? How are we going to move these electrons where they're available to other parts of the country? And Gary, you and I had a conversation about this, and it might be useful if you talked a little bit about, you know, the grid.
I'm going to do that very briefly, but I'm also conscious we're coming up on time and I want to take a couple of questions. So the issue with the grid, in my opinion, is you want to get very high utilization of these electrolyzers in order to make the hydrogen economically. That means moving a lot of power. Today, the transmission system in the United States just isn't well equipped to do that. We need much more high voltage transmission. I happen to be an advocate for HVDC, so I think and there's going to be a panel on that, so I'm not going to say a great deal about that. But being able to move power, if I take Arizona as example, we got to get those solar electrons from 10 o'clock to about 2 o'clock out of Arizona, because we're just awash in them. But at the same time, there's great wind to our north and our east, and we got to be able to get those electrons in. But let me now turn to the audience, and if we could maybe turn the lights up a little bit.
One comment.
Quickly.
Sorry, a quick comment. So I heard about a project that's in North Germany, off an island. They're doing offshore wind, and to get the electricity from the island to the mainland, instead of cabling it, they're piping it in the form of hydrogen. Yeah. And the logic behind that is that it costs 10% of the cost to make a pipe compared to making a cable. And Europe has, for example, this huge natural gas infrastructure, and I'm fairly sure that they're not interested in continuing their relationship with Russia to get their natural gas. So I have a feeling what's going on is that they're going to use that infrastructure to move hydrogen instead. And I am originally from the Netherlands. I know several projects, one in Amsterdam, one in Rotterdam, that are preparing to import vast amounts of hydrogen into the Netherlands for European consumption. So it's going to go that way. And there's a 2 gigawatt wind farm going up off of Ireland that is going to be totally dedicated to making hydrogen, to being shipped to Rotterdam.
Thanks, Henk. We have time for a couple of questions. Graciola, you've been raising your hand a bit. You want to go first? Let's get the microphone so that others can hear.
I wanted to ask about the elephant in the closet. The 250, minus 250 refrigeration that is needed, and the facilities needed to transport it. I'm just talking about hydrogen. So this is not something I work on, and I want to hear from you, particularly you. Well, because you raised the issue. You raised the issue.
Yeah, no, I did.
So what are you saying about it? I mean, don't forget, refrigeration is much more expensive than heating. We know that. So can we be realistic and say something about it? I mean, everything depends on that.
Maybe let me start with
Yeah.
that one, Bill. So hydrogen can be moved in 2 ways. One is being implied here as a liquid.
Yes.
And that requires exactly what you're talking about, Graciola, not only low temperatures, but high pressures as well. The amount of hydrogen that's going to be moved around that way, I think, is going to be pretty limited. It's going to go by trucks. In the United States, it can't go by rail, although there may be some effort afoot to try to do that. But it's just too expensive to move large volumes over large distances that way. Now, the other way is it can be moved as a gas. You know, we do that with natural gas right now. And that means through a pipeline by natural gas. Now, there's some issues with that as well. So Henk was emphasizing pipelining. The way this really works out in practice is there's going to be a balance between how far you want to move that hydrogen and how much big transmission you want to have so you can get the electrons to where you're going to use the hydrogen. And I'll give you an example of what I mean by that. So back to the hubs. California had a big hub centered out of the Los Angeles area. They're looking at Arizona right across the border to produce a lot of hydrogen using solar in hydrogen. Or I'm sorry, solar to make hydrogen. That then goes across the border 2 ways. They're looking at a pipeline, and they're also looking at trucking. But we move the power, we get the power in Arizona and use it there, and then we have just a short hop over into California. And I think that's the way a lot of this is going to happen.
Yeah, but any trucking requires fuel, another fuel, because we don't have trucks that run.
We do have trucks. I went to Korea to visit with Hyundai, and they're the leaders in the world with hydrogen trucks and buses. They've already got a pilot project in Switzerland where they have a fleet of trucks and hydrogen fueling stations, and they're moving, goods as we speak. That's their first test project. But we can make hydrogen trucks and buses. That's the future. It has to be that way. And so not only are we moving hydrogen, but we're moving hydrogen using hydrogen. And if you talk to the shipping industry, they're doing the same thing. They're going to convert to hydrogen for shipping. Then that's their way of getting to 100%.
So we know that hydrogen is the perfect fuel.
We'll take this offline. Very good, but I want to get a couple of other questions if we've got time for it. Yes, this gentleman right here.
Yeah, so there's been some news recently about the idea that there's natural hydrogen being continuously produced in Earth's crust that might be capturable. What can you tell us about the practicality of that?
You want me to take that one?
Go ahead.
Yes, there has for a very long time been a view that there must be a certain amount of hydrogen that's produced naturally. Deep hydrogen, as in it's being produced well down into the earth. it appears like there may have actually been a discovery in France of exactly that. Kind of waiting to hear what the actual size of that is. It definitely has hydrogen. Sorry? Yes, so this is going to be a new space, I think. Watch, you know, the people who look for this kind of thing is the oil industry. They, to the best of my knowledge, never did look for it. They're looking for it now, and that it may be real, but we have no idea at this point how real it is. I think I've got time for one more. I think we had this. You want to go first? Yeah, please go ahead.
Quick question. When I think when lots of people hear hydrogen, they hear danger. How is this going to be implemented safely?
Yeah, the first thing that comes to mind when people hear hydrogen is the Hindenburg bomb. Now, I would like to point out, you know what actually caught on fire the Hindenburg? It was the skin. It was a highly flammable nitrocellulose. That's what actually caught on fire, and then the blimp burned after that. But Henk, you've been using it.
Yeah, so what we do in Hawaii is we make hydrogen, and then we bring people to the ranch to show them how safe hydrogen is. I mean, you compare hydrogen to any other fossil fuel, and hydrogen is way safer. If any hydrogen escapes, it leaves the room immediately. We turn on we have a little hydrogen walk burner where we can cook stuff. We turn that sucker on, and you can hear the hydrogen go, tsh, and you try to light it on fire up here. There's no way. It's moving too fast. You have to turn it down so it's not moving so fast, and then you turn it on, then you turn it up. The other thing about hydrogen is that it doesn't radiate heat. And so if you can put your finger right next to a hydrogen flame, and we show this to everybody, make them do it, it makes a terrible campfire because it's not going to give you any heat from the campfire. But that's another safety aspect. So we bring politicians, we bring firefighters, and we show them what's up with hydrogen. There's so much nonsense. We even got the story about the hydrogen bomb, which has absolutely nothing to do with it. You know,
we're going to have to call it quits there. But on that theme,
note.
on that note, how many of you have a butane or propane LPG grill? Those things are phenomenally dangerous. You know why? Because if they leak, that fuel just lays there at the ground, looking for an ignition source. And when it does, you'll get a concussive explosion. Hydrogen is vastly more safe than what those propane or butane or LPG sources are. With that, I'd like to thank our panelists, and I think we are going to call it a wrap.